So before you take comfortable, take a minute to like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time it is for you. Deep in the shadowed valleys of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges like whispered secrets, there exists a darkness that textbooks refuse to acknowledge. For over 2 centuries, these isolated mountains have harbored religious movements so twisted, so dangerous, that their very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about faith in America. Today, we're venturing into territories where salvation came with a price measured in blood, where prophets preached from pulpits built on human bones, and where entire communities vanished overnight, leaving behind only cryptic symbols carved into trees and the lingering scent of sulfur. Before we descend into these forgotten hollows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. What you're about to discover isn't just history, it's a warning about what happens when isolation, desperation, and fanaticism collide in the heart of America's most unforgiving wilderness. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next, especially if you've ever wondered what lurks behind the closed doors of mountain communities that outsiders never see. 1. The Serpent's Embrace Covenant. In the winter of 1923, a charismatic drifter named Ezekiel Thorne arrived in the remote valley of Whisper Creek, Tennessee, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and eyes that locals described as burning with unholy fire. Thorne claimed to have received divine visions during a near-death experience in a coal mine collapse, visions that revealed humanity's true path to salvation through the embrace of God's most feared creatures. Within months, he had established the Serpent's Embrace Covenant, a religious movement that would terrorize the Cumberland Mountains for nearly 2 decades. The Covenant's central doctrine was deceptively simple. Only by allowing venomous serpents to bite them could believers achieve spiritual purification. But Thorne's interpretation went far beyond traditional snake handling. Members were required to undergo monthly blessing ceremonies, where they would be bitten by increasingly deadly species, copperheads, timber rattlers, and eventually exotic vipers that Thorne somehow acquired through mysterious channels. Those who survived were considered chosen. Those who died were deemed unworthy of salvation. The Covenant's compound, built into the side of a limestone cliff, housed over 300 followers at its peak. Visitors described entering through a narrow cave system where the walls were lined with glass terrariums containing hundreds of serpents. The main sanctuary featured a central pit filled with writhing snakes of every deadly variety found in North America. During services, Thorne would descend into this pit wearing only a white robe, emerging covered in bite marks that somehow never seemed to affect him. Former members who escaped the Covenant told horrifying stories of children as young as 8 being forced to handle venomous snakes as part of their religious education. Medical records from the nearby town of Millfield show a suspicious pattern of snakebite victims arriving at the hospital between 1923 and 1941, many of whom died from exotic venoms that shouldn't have existed anywhere in Tennessee. Local authorities repeatedly attempted to investigate the compound, but officers reported becoming violently ill whenever they approached the cave entrance, suffering from symptoms that included temporary blindness, severe nausea, and inexplicable terror. The Covenant's influence extended far beyond their mountain sanctuary. Thorne's followers infiltrated local businesses, schools, and even the sheriff's department. They established a network of safe houses throughout the region where runaway children and desperate adults could find shelter for a price. New recruits were gradually introduced to the Covenant's practices, beginning with handling harmless snakes and progressing to more dangerous species as their faith deepened. The most disturbing aspect of the Serpent's Embrace Covenant was their breeding program. Thorne claimed to have developed techniques for creating hybrid serpents with enhanced venom potency. Wildlife biologists who later examined the abandoned compound found evidence of primitive genetic experiments, including cages containing snake specimens that displayed characteristics of multiple species. Several of these creatures were never identified, suggesting Thorne had somehow created entirely new varieties of venomous reptiles. The Covenant's reign of terror ended abruptly in 1941 when a massive fire consumed their compound during a winter storm. Official reports blamed faulty wiring, but survivors claimed the blaze started simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the cave system. When firefighters finally accessed the ruins, they found the remains of over 200 people, many of whom appeared to have died from snake bites rather than smoke inhalation. Thorne's body was never recovered, though investigators discovered his leather satchel containing detailed journals written in a code that has never been deciphered. 2. The Blood Moon Pilgrims. High in the Virginia Blue Ridge Mountains, where ancient Cherokee legends speak of doorways between worlds, a religious sect known as the Blood Moon Pilgrims established their settlement in 1889. Led by a former Methodist minister named Jeremiah Blackwood, who claimed to have received revelations during a total lunar eclipse, the Pilgrims believed that human sacrifice was necessary to maintain the cosmic balance and prevent the end of the world. Blackwood's transformation from respected clergyman to cult leader began after he witnessed a lunar eclipse from a mountaintop near his parish. According to his later writings, discovered in a hidden chamber beneath the Pilgrims' meeting house, he experienced a vision of the moon speaking to him in a voice like grinding stone. The moon revealed that every blood moon throughout history had been sustained by human sacrifice, and that without regular offerings, the celestial body would fall from the sky, plunging the world into eternal darkness. The Blood Moon Pilgrims constructed their settlement around a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, where they performed their monthly rituals during the new moon. The site featured a stone altar stained black with what forensic analysis later confirmed was human blood. Surrounding the altar were 13 wooden posts where victims were bound during the ceremonies. The Pilgrims developed an elaborate theology around their practices, claiming that voluntary sacrifice guaranteed the victim's immediate ascension to heaven, while involuntary sacrifice merely delayed their spiritual journey. What made the Blood Moon Pilgrims particularly dangerous was their recruitment strategy. Blackwood and his followers targeted isolated families throughout the Appalachian region, offering food, shelter, and community to those struggling with poverty and hardship. New members were gradually indoctrinated through a process that began with seemingly innocent Bible study sessions and progressed to increasingly disturbing theological discussions about the necessity of blood sacrifice. The Pilgrims maintained detailed records of their activities, including a ledger that tracked the names, ages, and spiritual readiness of potential sacrificial victims. These records, discovered by investigators in 1923, revealed that the cult had killed at least 47 people over a 34-year period. The victims included both willing volunteers from within the community and unwilling captives taken from neighboring settlements. Children were considered particularly valuable sacrifices, as their innocent blood was believed to be more pleasing to the lunar deity. Local law enforcement repeatedly received reports of missing persons in the areas surrounding the Pilgrims' settlement, but investigations were hampered by the cult's sophisticated counter-surveillance network. The Pilgrims had established lookout posts throughout the mountains, connected by a system of signal fires that could alert the main settlement to approaching outsiders. They also corrupted local officials through a combination of bribery and blackmail, ensuring that investigations into their activities were routinely mishandled or abandoned. The Blood Moon Pilgrims' influence extended beyond their immediate community through a network of sympathizers who had been partially indoctrinated but never fully initiated into the cult's murderous practices. These individuals, scattered throughout Virginia and West Virginia, served as informants and recruiters, identifying potential victims and providing intelligence about law enforcement activities. Some held positions of trust in their communities, including teachers, shopkeepers, and even a circuit judge who later confessed to directing vulnerable individuals toward the Pilgrim settlement. The cult's downfall came in 1923 when a survivor of one of their rituals managed to escape and reach federal authorities. Sarah Mitchell, a 16-year-old girl who had been selected for sacrifice during a blood moon ceremony, broke free from her restraints and fled through the mountain wilderness. Her testimony led to a massive federal investigation that culminated in a dawn raid on the Pilgrims' settlement. Investigators found evidence of the cult's activities, including the ritual chamber and detailed records of their killings, but Blackwood and most of his inner circle had vanished into the mountains. 3. The Hollow Earth Disciples. In the coal-rich hills of eastern Kentucky, where underground caverns stretch for miles beneath the surface, a bizarre religious movement emerged in 1907 that would challenge the very foundations of Christian theology. The Hollow Earth Disciples, founded by a former geology professor named Dr. Marcus Cornelius, believed that the Garden of Eden existed in a vast underground world accessible through specific cave systems in the Appalachian Mountains. Dr. Cornelius had been dismissed from his position at a Tennessee university after publicly advocating for the Hollow Earth theory, the idea that the planet contained a habitable interior world. His academic disgrace drove him to seek validation for his beliefs in the isolated mountains of Kentucky, where he began preaching to coal miners and their families about the spiritual significance of the underground realm. According to Cornelius, the surface world was merely a testing ground for souls, while the true paradise lay beneath their feet. The disciples established their community around the entrance to Mammoth Cave, a massive underground system that they believed connected to the inner earth. Cornelius claimed to have discovered ancient Hebrew inscriptions deep within the cave system, which he interpreted as proof that the biblical patriarchs had descended into the hollow earth after their earthly deaths. He taught that faithful believers could achieve immediate salvation by following these ancient paths into the underground paradise. What began as an eccentric religious movement quickly evolved into something far more sinister. Cornelius instituted a practice called the descent, where followers would venture deep into the cave system to commune with the spirits of the departed. These expeditions, initially lasting only a few hours, gradually extended to days or even weeks as participants sought to penetrate deeper into what they believed was the hollow earth. Many never returned, and those who did often exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma. The disciples developed an elaborate underground infrastructure within the cave system, including living quarters, food storage areas, and workshops where they manufactured their own tools and clothing. They believed that surface materials were spiritually contaminated and that only items created in the underground world were suitable for use in their religious practices. The community's children were raised entirely within the cave system, never seeing sunlight until they reached adulthood and were deemed ready for surface missions. Dr. Cornelius claimed to possess a map of the underground world, supposedly revealed to him through divine visions. This map, drawn on sheets of cave-dwelling bat leather, showed a complex network of tunnels leading to various spiritual destinations, including the Garden of Eden, the River Styx, and the throne room of God himself. Followers who wished to undertake pilgrimages to these locations were required to undergo intensive preparation, including fasting, meditation, and ritual purification ceremonies. The disciples' underground society operated according to strict hierarchical principles, with Dr. Cornelius serving as the supreme prophet and guide. Below him were the Deep Walkers, experienced cave explorers who led expeditions into the most dangerous sections of the underground world. The community's day-to-day operations were managed by the Surface Guardians, who maintained the connection between the underground society and the outside world through carefully controlled trade relationships. Local authorities first became aware of the Hollow Earth disciples in 1915, when several missing persons reports led investigators to the cave entrance. What they discovered was a thriving underground community of over 150 people, many of whom had been living in complete darkness for years. The disciples had developed their own system of navigation using sound and touch, moving through the cave system with an expertise that amazed and terrified the investigating officers. The most disturbing aspect of the disciples' practices was their treatment of those who expressed doubt about Dr. Cornelius's teachings. Skeptics were subjected to enlightenment trials, where they were taken to the deepest accessible parts of the cave system and left alone for extended periods. Many emerged from these ordeals as devoted believers, while others never returned at all. The disciples claimed that those who failed to return had been called to join the spiritual realm permanently, but investigators suspected a more sinister explanation. 4. The Crimson Harvest Assembly. In the autumn of 1896, a traveling preacher named Reverend Silas Cordwood arrived in the remote mountain community of Ravens Hollow, North Carolina, carrying a message that would transform the peaceful farming settlement into one of the most feared locations in the entire Appalachian region. Cordwood preached that the second coming of Christ could only be achieved through the systematic purification of humanity, a process that required the elimination of all those deemed spiritually impure. The Crimson Harvest Assembly, as Cordwood's followers came to be known, developed an elaborate theological framework around the concept of spiritual agriculture. They believed that human souls were like crops that required careful cultivation, and that some individuals were inherently good seed, while others were weeds that needed to be eliminated to prevent contamination of the spiritual harvest. This twisted interpretation of Christian doctrine provided religious justification for what would become one of the most systematic campaigns of murder in American history. Cordwood possessed an uncanny ability to identify the deepest fears and insecurities of his potential converts. He targeted families struggling with poverty, illness, or social isolation, offering them a sense of purpose and belonging within his growing community. New members underwent an intensive indoctrination process that began with seemingly innocent Bible study sessions and gradually progressed to more disturbing discussions about the necessity of violence in service of God's will. The assembly established their headquarters in a converted barn on the outskirts of Ravens Hollow, where they conducted their weekly worship services. The interior of the building was decorated with disturbing religious artwork depicting scenes of divine judgment and purification. The centerpiece was a massive wooden cross stained with what members claimed was the blood of Christ, but which investigators later determined was human blood from the assembly's victims. Cordwood taught that God communicated his will through a process called divine revelation, where faithful members would receive visions identifying individuals who needed to be eliminated for the greater good of humanity. These visions typically targeted outsiders, religious minorities, and anyone who questioned the assembly's authority. The identified victims were subjected to mock trials where their spiritual worthiness was evaluated according to Cordwood's twisted interpretation of biblical law. The assembly's methods of execution were designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological terror. Victims were often tortured for days before being killed, with assembly members taking turns participating in the violence as a form of religious devotion. The bodies were disposed of in a network of abandoned mine shafts throughout the region, making it difficult for authorities to determine the full scope of the assembly's activities. What made the Crimson Harvest Assembly particularly dangerous was their ability to operate with impunity for over a decade. Cordwood had carefully cultivated relationships with local officials, including the sheriff and several prominent businessmen who either actively supported the assembly's activities or were too intimidated to interfere. The cult also maintained an extensive intelligence network that monitored the movements and activities of potential threats to their operations. The assembly's influence extended throughout the region through a network of affiliated groups that shared their theological beliefs but operated independently. These satellite communities served as recruiting centers and safe houses for assembly members, creating a web of support that made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to dismantle the organization. Some of these affiliated groups continue to operate in remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains, maintaining the Assembly's legacy of violence and terror. The Assembly's recruitment strategy focused heavily on exploiting family structures within mountain communities. Cordwood understood that in isolated Appalachian settlements, extended families often formed the backbone of social organization. By converting key family patriarchs, he could bring entire bloodlines under his influence with minimal resistance. The assembly developed what they called bloodline purification, where families were ranked according to their spiritual worthiness, with those deemed inferior marked for elimination. Children born into assembly families underwent a horrifying indoctrination process that began in infancy. They were raised to view violence as a sacred duty and were taught to identify spiritual contamination in others through a complex system of behavioral and physical indicators. By adolescence, these children had been transformed into fanatical believers who would willingly participate in the torture and murder of their own neighbors without question or remorse. The assembly's downfall began in 1907 when a survivor of one of their purification ceremonies managed to escape and reach federal authorities in Charlotte. Thomas Brennan, a traveling merchant who had witnessed the assembly's torture methods firsthand, provided detailed testimony about their operations. His account led to a coordinated federal investigation that would ultimately expose the full scope of the assembly's crimes and bring an end to their reign of terror. 5. The Bone Cathedral Congregation. Deep within the Virginia wilderness, where ancient Cherokee burial grounds lay hidden beneath centuries of fallen leaves, a religious sect emerged in 1912 that would horrify even the most hardened investigators. The Bone Cathedral Congregation, led by a former medical student named Dr. Phineas Ashworth, believed that human remains possessed divine power that could be harnessed through specific ritualistic practices. Dr. Ashworth had been expelled from medical school after being caught conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers, experiments that his professors described as both scientifically worthless and morally reprehensible. His fascination with human remains led him to the remote mountains of Virginia, where he established a community based on the worship of death and the venerations of human bones. The congregation's central doctrine held that the physical remains of the dead contained fragments of their souls, and that these fragments could be absorbed by the living through ritual consumption. The congregation constructed their place of worship inside a natural cave system that they expanded through years of careful excavation. The interior walls were lined with human skulls, arranged in intricate patterns that Ashworth claimed represented divine mathematical principles. The central altar was constructed entirely from human bones, carefully selected and arranged to create a massive structure that dominated the underground cathedral. Hundreds of femurs formed the supporting columns, while rib cages and pelvises created decorative elements throughout the sacred space. New members of the congregation were required to participate in what Ashworth called communion with the eternal, ceremonies where they would consume small portions of ground human bone mixed with wine. These rituals were designed to create a spiritual connection between the living and the dead, but they often resulted in severe illness and death among participants. Those who survived the initial communion were considered blessed and were gradually introduced to more intensive practices involving larger quantities of human remains. The congregation's bone collection came from multiple sources, including recently deceased members of their own community, bodies stolen from local cemeteries, and victims of their recruitment activities. Ashworth taught that different types of human remains possessed different spiritual properties. Children's bones provided innocence, elderly bones offered wisdom, and the bones of those who had died violently contained powerful protective energy. This belief system created a constant demand for fresh remains that drove the congregation to increasingly desperate measures. Dr. Ashworth claimed to possess the ability to communicate with the spirits of the dead through direct contact with their bones. During these seances, he would enter a trance-like state while handling skulls and other remains, allegedly receiving messages from the deceased about the location of hidden treasures, the identities of enemies, and predictions about future events. These performances convinced many followers that Ashworth possessed genuine supernatural abilities, strengthening their devotion to his teachings. The congregation developed an elaborate hierarchy based on members' willingness to participate in increasingly disturbing rituals. The inner circle, known as the Bone Keepers, were responsible for maintaining the cathedral's collection of human remains and for conducting the most sacred ceremonies. These individuals had typically consumed so much ground bone over the years that they suffered from severe health problems, including kidney failure, neurological damage, and a distinctive grayish pallor that marked them as devoted followers. Local authorities first became aware of the Bone Cathedral congregation in 1925 when a cemetery caretaker reported the systematic theft of recently buried bodies. The investigation led to the discovery of the congregation's underground cathedral, where investigators found evidence of their macabre practices. The sight of the bone-lined chambers and the altar constructed from human remains was so disturbing that several officers required medical attention after the initial raid. 6. The Eternal Flame Zealots. In the coal-rich mountains of West Virginia, where underground fires sometimes burned for decades, a religious movement emerged in 1903 that would terrorize the region for over 30 years. The Eternal Flame Zealots, founded by a charismatic coal miner named Prophet Malachi Stone, believed that divine judgment would come through purification by fire, and that only those who had been properly prepared through ritualistic burning could survive the coming apocalypse. Stone's transformation from ordinary coal miner to religious fanatic began after he survived a mine explosion that killed 17 of his fellow workers. During his recovery, he claimed to have experienced visions of a great fire that would consume the entire world, leaving only the faithful to inherit a purified earth. These visions convinced him that he had been chosen to prepare humanity for the coming conflagration through a process he called sacred burning. The Zealots established their community around a natural gas seep that produced a perpetual flame on the side of a mountain. They believed this flame was a direct manifestation of divine power and constructed their places of worship around it. The main sanctuary featured a central pit where the eternal flame burned continuously, surrounded by smaller fire pits used for various ritual purposes. Members were required to tend these flames constantly, ensuring that they never extinguished. New recruits to the Eternal Flame Zealots underwent a gradual process of fire-based initiation that began with exposure to intense heat and progressed to actual burning. Stone taught that human flesh needed to be gradually conditioned to withstand the fires of judgment, and that this conditioning could only be achieved through repeated exposure to increasingly severe burns. Members who successfully completed this process were considered flame-blessed and were granted elevated status within the community. The Zealots' practices included regular purification ceremonies, where members would subject themselves to controlled burning as a form of worship. These rituals often resulted in severe injuries and death, but survivors were celebrated as having achieved a higher spiritual state. The community maintained detailed records of these ceremonies, including descriptions of the burns inflicted and the spiritual revelations allegedly received during the process. Stone claimed to possess immunity to fire, a gift he demonstrated through increasingly dramatic displays of flame walking and fire handling. These performances drew crowds from throughout the region and helped recruit new members to the Zealots' cause. However, former members who escaped the community reported that Stone used various tricks and preparations to protect himself during these demonstrations, while requiring his followers to subject themselves to genuine burning without any protection. The Zealots' influence extended throughout the coal mining region through a network of sympathizers who shared their apocalyptic beliefs. These individuals, many of whom worked in the mines, helped spread the Zealots' message and identify potential recruits. The community also maintained relationships with other religious extremists throughout Appalachia, creating a loose confederation of groups that shared resources and information. The Eternal Flame, Zealots' reign of terror continued until 1934, when a massive fire at their mountain compound killed over 200 members. Investigators determined that the blaze had been deliberately set during a mass purification ceremony, apparently in anticipation of the apocalyptic conflagration that Stone had long predicted. The few survivors found wandering the mountains in the aftermath were so severely burned and traumatized that they were unable to provide coherent testimony about what had occurred. 7. The Whispering Shadows Ministry. In the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Tennessee, where Cherokee legends speak of spirits that walk between worlds, a religious sect emerged in 1899 that would challenge the very boundaries between the living and the dead. The Whispering Shadows Ministry, led by a former spiritualist medium named Madame Evangeline Thorne, claimed to have discovered a method for communicating directly with deceased souls and harnessing their power for the benefit of the living. Madame Thorne had gained notoriety throughout the Southeast as a spiritualist medium who conducted seances for wealthy clients seeking to contact deceased relatives. Her reputation for producing seemingly authentic supernatural phenomena attracted followers from across the region, many of whom were grieving the loss of loved ones and desperate for any connection to the spirit world. Thorne's transition from medium to cult leader began when she claimed to have received a revelation from the deceased that fundamentally changed her understanding of the relationship between life and death. The ministry established their headquarters in a series of abandoned Cherokee caves that Thorne claimed were sacred sites where the boundary between worlds was naturally thin. The caves were modified to include chambers for different types of spiritual communication, with specific areas designated for contacting different categories of deceased souls. The main sanctuary featured a central chamber where Thorne conducted her most important rituals, surrounded by smaller rooms used for private consultations with the dead. Thorne taught that the deceased retained consciousness and supernatural abilities after death, and that these powers could be accessed by the living through proper ritualistic procedures. She claimed to have developed techniques for summoning specific spirits and compelling them to perform tasks for the benefit of ministry members. These services ranged from providing information about hidden treasures to cursing enemies and protecting the faithful from various threats. The ministry's practices centered around elaborate seances that often lasted for hours or even days. Participants would gather in the cave chambers, where Thorne would guide them through complex rituals designed to attract the attention of deceased spirits. These ceremonies typically involved the use of personal items belonging to the dead, including clothing, jewelry, and in some cases, human remains that had been secretly obtained from local cemeteries. New members of the ministry were required to undergo a process called spiritual opening, where they would participate in increasingly intense seances designed to develop their ability to communicate with the dead. This process often resulted in severe psychological trauma, as participants reported experiencing terrifying visions and hearing disturbing voices that they believed were messages from deceased souls. Those who successfully completed the spiritual opening were considered to have achieved a higher level of spiritual development and were granted access to the ministry's most sacred rituals. The ministry's influence extended throughout the region through a network of affiliated mediums who had been trained in Thorne's techniques. These individuals operated independently, but maintained connections to the main organization, providing services to clients who were unable to travel to the ministry's cave headquarters. Some of these affiliated mediums established their own communities based on Thorne's teachings, creating a loose network of spiritualist groups throughout the Appalachian Mountains. What made the Whispering Shadows ministry particularly dangerous was their involvement in activities that went far beyond spiritual communication. Thorne and her followers were accused of using their supposed supernatural abilities to manipulate and control their clients, extracting large sums of money and property in exchange for spiritual services. They also allegedly used information obtained during seances to blackmail prominent community members, building a network of influence that extended into local government and law enforcement. The ministry's darker practices included rituals that required the use of human blood and other bodily substances, which Thorne claimed were necessary for establishing strong connections with the spirit world. These ceremonies often involved self-mutilation and other forms of physical harm that resulted in serious injuries and occasional deaths among participants. The ministry maintained detailed records of these rituals, including descriptions of the spirits contacted and the services they provided. The ministry's most disturbing practice involved what Thorne called spiritual harvesting, where recently deceased individuals were allegedly prevented from moving on to the afterlife and instead bound to serve the living members of the community. This process required the ministry to maintain constant surveillance of local death records and to conduct secret rituals at grave sites within hours of burial. Former members who escaped the ministry described midnight expeditions to fresh graves where Thorne would perform elaborate ceremonies designed to trap the souls of the recently departed. Local authorities first became aware of the Whispering Shadows ministry in 1918 when several families reported that their recently deceased relatives had been appearing to them in dreams, begging to be released from some form of spiritual bondage. These reports initially seemed like normal grief responses, but the consistency of the accounts and the specific details provided by the dreamers suggested something more sinister. Investigation revealed that all of the affected families had received visits from ministry members offering to help them communicate with their deceased loved ones. The ministry's downfall began in 1925 when a former member named Rebecca Caldwell provided detailed testimony about their practices to federal investigators. Caldwell had lost her husband in a mining accident and had sought comfort through the ministry's services, only to discover that Thorne was using her grief to extract money and property while providing no genuine spiritual assistance. Her testimony led to a comprehensive investigation that exposed the full scope of the ministry's fraudulent and dangerous activities. 8. The Judgment Mountain Collective, high in the remote peaks of western North Carolina, where winter storms can isolate communities for months at a time, a religious movement emerged in 1914 that would become one of the most secretive and dangerous cults in Appalachian history. The Judgment Mountain Collective, led by a former circuit judge named Solomon Blackthorne, believed that the end times had already begun and that they had been chosen to serve as God's instruments of divine justice on earth. Judge Blackthorne's transformation from respected legal official to cult leader began after he presided over a controversial murder trial that resulted in the execution of an innocent man. The discovery of the condemned man's innocence after his death drove Blackthorne into a psychological crisis that culminated in what he described as a divine revelation about the inadequacy of human justice systems. He became convinced that only direct divine intervention could properly judge human souls, and that he had been chosen to establish a new form of spiritual court system. The collective established their community on a remote mountain plateau, accessible only through a narrow trail that could be easily defended against outsiders. They constructed a series of buildings designed to resemble a courthouse complex, complete with a main hall for conducting trials, holding cells for prisoners, and execution chambers for carrying out sentences. The centerpiece was a massive wooden structure that served as both courthouse and place of worship, where Blackthorne conducted his spiritual trials. Blackthorne taught that traditional legal systems were corrupted by human weakness, and that true justice could only be achieved through direct divine guidance. He claimed to receive instructions from God about which individuals needed to be brought before his spiritual court for judgment. These instructions typically identified people who had committed crimes that went unpunished by conventional law enforcement. But the collective's definition of criminal behavior expanded to include virtually any activity that Blackthorne deemed spiritually offensive. The collective's trials followed a twisted parody of legal procedures, with Blackthorne serving as both judge and prosecutor, while appointed members of the community acted as witnesses and jury. The accused were rarely present during these proceedings, as the collective believed that spiritual crimes could be judged based on divine revelation rather than earthly evidence. Sentences ranged from spiritual penalties, like excommunication, to physical punishments, including imprisonment, torture, and execution. New members of the collective were recruited through a process that exploited their frustration with perceived injustices in their communities. Blackthorne specifically targeted individuals who had been victims of crimes or who believed that criminals in their area had escaped proper punishment. These recruits were gradually indoctrinated into the collective's belief system through intensive study sessions focused on biblical passages about divine justice and the inadequacy of human law. The collective maintained an extensive intelligence network throughout the region, gathering information about crimes, disputes, and moral transgressions that could be used to justify their interventions. This network included sympathizers in local law enforcement, church congregations, and business communities who provided information about potential targets for the collective's brand of divine justice. The information was used to compile detailed dossiers on individuals who might be subject to spiritual trials. What made the Judgment Mountain Collective particularly dangerous was their systematic approach to vigilante justice. Unlike other cults that engaged in random violence, the collective carefully planned their operations to maximize both practical and psychological impact. They would study their targets for weeks or months before acting, gathering information about their daily routines, family relationships, and personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited during their capture and trial. The collective's methods of enforcement were designed to terrorize entire communities rather than simply punish individual transgressors. They would often leave behind evidence of their activities, including written judgments explaining their actions and warnings about future consequences for those who failed to meet their moral standards. These messages were crafted to create fear and uncertainty among the general population, making people more likely to conform to the collective's interpretation of proper behavior. Blackthorn claimed to possess supernatural abilities that allowed him to perceive the spiritual guilt of accused individuals, regardless of their earthly actions. During trials, he would enter what appeared to be a trance-like state and deliver lengthy pronouncements about the spiritual crimes committed by the accused. These performances were designed to convince both collective members and outside observers that Blackthorn was receiving genuine divine guidance, strengthening his authority over the community. The collective's influence extended far beyond their mountain stronghold through a network of affiliated groups that shared their beliefs about divine justice. These satellite communities operated independently, but maintained communication with the main collective, sharing information about potential targets and coordinating their activities to avoid conflicts with each other. Some of these affiliated groups focused on specific types of crimes, such as adultery or theft, while others pursued broader campaigns against perceived moral corruption. The collective's operations were characterized by meticulous planning and sophisticated execution that reflected Blackthorn's legal background. They maintained detailed records of their trials and sentences, including written justifications for their actions and assessments of their effectiveness in deterring future crimes. These records provided valuable evidence for investigators who later sought to understand the full scope of the collective's activities. Local authorities struggled to combat the Judgment Mountain Collective due to their remote location and the support they received from sympathizers throughout the region. The collective's intelligence network provided early warning of law enforcement activities, allowing them to avoid capture or to relocate their operations when necessary. Their mountain stronghold was naturally defensible and could only be approached through terrain that favored defenders over attackers. The collective's downfall began in 1931 when a coordinated federal investigation exposed their operations and led to raids on their mountain compound. The investigation was triggered by the discovery of mass graves containing the remains of dozens of individuals who had been subjected to the collective's form of divine justice. The evidence collected during these raids revealed the systematic nature of the collective's crimes and provided the basis for prosecuting surviving members. However, by the time federal agents reached the mountain compound, they found it largely abandoned. Blackthorne and most of his inner circle had disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind only their records and the physical evidence of their activities. Some investigators believe that remnants of the collective continued to operate in remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains for decades after the official investigation concluded, carrying on their campaign of vigilante justice in secret. These 8 cults represent only the documented cases, the ones where enough evidence survived to piece together their horrifying stories. In the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where government authority has always been more suggestion than reality, how many other religious movements flourished and died without leaving any trace? How many families simply vanished into the mountain mist, their fate known only to the ancient peaks that watched in silence? The isolation that breeds these movements hasn't disappeared. If anything, modern technology has made it easier for charismatic leaders to find vulnerable followers while remaining hidden from outside scrutiny. The same economic desperation, social isolation, and spiritual hunger that fed these historical cults continue to exist in countless mountain communities across Appalachia. What's perhaps most chilling is how these cults operated with such impunity for decades. The Serpent's Embrace Covenant terrorized Tennessee for nearly 20 years. The Blood Moon Pilgrims claimed 47 lives over 3 decades. The Judgment Mountain Collective maintained their reign of terror for 17 years before federal intervention. These weren't brief episodes of madness. They were sustained campaigns of horror that reshaped entire regions of Appalachia. The common threads running through these 8 cults reveal a disturbing pattern. Each exploited the isolation and vulnerability of mountain communities. Each twisted legitimate religious concepts into justifications for unspeakable acts. Each developed sophisticated networks of support and intelligence that allowed them to operate beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. Most disturbing of all, each left behind followers who carried their teachings into the shadows, ensuring that their influence would outlast their official existence. Consider the children raised within these movements. Those who survived the Hollow Earth Disciples' underground society emerged into a world they had never seen, unable to function in normal daylight. The offspring of the Crimson Harvest Assembly were trained from birth to identify spiritual contamination in their neighbors. The young people who escaped the Eternal Flame Zealots bore scars that marked them as different for the rest of their lives. These traumatized survivors scattered throughout Appalachia, carrying with them the seeds of the darkness they had experienced. Modern investigators studying these movements have identified recurring patterns that suggest some form of communication or shared knowledge between different cults. The symbols carved into trees around abandoned compounds show remarkable similarities, despite being separated by hundreds of miles and decades of time. The ritual practices described in recovered documents contain common elements that appear to have been adapted from much older sources. Some researchers theorize that these cults were part of a larger network of extremist movements that shared resources and information across the Appalachian region. The physical evidence of these cults continues to surface in unexpected places. Hikers occasionally discover bone fragments in remote cave systems. Construction workers uncover mass graves during road building projects. Metal detectors reveal caches of ritual objects buried near historical sites. Each discovery raises new questions about the true scope of these movements and their lasting impact on the region. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports from modern law enforcement agencies who patrol the same areas where these cults once operated. Officers describe encounters with isolated communities that maintain unusual religious practices. They report finding abandoned structures that show signs of recent use, despite being supposedly uninhabited for decades. Some describe meeting individuals whose behavior and appearance suggest they might be descendants of the original cult members, still practicing modified versions of their ancestors' beliefs. The psychological impact of these movements extended far beyond their immediate victims. Entire communities developed collective trauma responses that persisted for generations. Families passed down warnings about specific locations, certain symbols, and particular types of strangers. Local folklore became intertwined with memories of real terror, creating a complex web of fact and legend that continues to influence behavior in mountain communities today. What makes these historical accounts particularly relevant is how they illuminate the conditions that can transform ordinary religious faith into something monstrous. The isolation of mountain communities, the absence of strong institutional oversight, the presence of charismatic leaders with mental illness or criminal intent, these factors haven't disappeared from modern Appalachia. If anything, economic decline and social disruption have made some communities even more vulnerable to exploitation by extremist movements. The investigative files on these 8 cults remain sealed in federal archives, with many documents classified for reasons that officials refuse to explain. The few researchers who have gained access to these materials describe discoveries that challenge our understanding of what actually occurred in these mountain communities. Some evidence suggests that certain cults maintained contact with similar movements in other regions, possibly coordinating their activities on a national scale. The descendants of cult survivors continue to live throughout Appalachia, often unaware of their family histories. Genealogical research has revealed that many prominent families in the region have connections to these movements, either as victims or perpetrators. Some have embraced this dark heritage, while others have spent generations trying to escape its influence. The trauma passes down through bloodlines, like a genetic marker, manifesting in unexpected ways across multiple generations. As we conclude this journey into Appalachia's darkest spiritual corners, remember that these weren't ancient civilizations or foreign cultures. These were American communities operating within living memory. Some of the last surviving witnesses to these events are still alive today, though most refuse to speak publicly about their experiences. The silence that surrounds these movements isn't just about protecting privacy or avoiding painful memories. It's about acknowledging that the capacity for such darkness exists within all of us, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The mountains remember everything. In the deepest hollows where morning mist still clings to ancient ridges, where cell phones lose signal and GPS systems fail, where the only sounds are wind through the trees and the distant echo of something that might be laughter or might be screaming. In these places, the past isn't really past. It's waiting, patient as stone for the next desperate soul willing to trade everything for a glimpse of something beyond the ordinary world. If you found yourself holding your breath during parts of this exploration, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Our next investigation takes us to the abandoned psychiatric hospitals of the Northeast, where experimental treatments created horrors that make these mountain cults seem almost quaint by comparison. And if you know of other dark chapters in American religious history that deserve attention, drop them in the comments below. The shadows of our past are deeper than most people realize, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones we're most afraid to tell. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous places aren't always the ones marked on maps. Sometimes they're hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone desperate enough to ignore the warnings carved into the trees. Stay curious, but stay vigilant. The mountains are always watching, and they never forget.